Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunker Builds. Today I'll be experimenting with getting a realistic wood grain finish on the grips of this DL-44 blaster. Alright, once again, this is a free file that I found on Thingiverse. I will link it as well as all the materials I used down in the description below. I started off by cleaning up the prints for the base and prepping them for wood filler since I knew I'd need about 45 minutes for the wood filler to dry. I've become pretty partial to this technique. I know lots of people like to use Bondo, and this stuff definitely doesn't dry as hard as Bondo would, but it's nice to not have to worry about all the toxic dust floating around my garage. And as long as you wait for the wood filler to dry fully and sand it with a gentle hand, the results are really great. I like to apply a lot more than I need and then spread it around nice and thick, but before letting it dry, I scrape off the excess. Doing this ensures that all the recesses you need filled get properly filled, and then scraping that excess off eliminates a lot of sanding time. And as the base was drying, I hopped over to my belt sander to begin cleaning up some of the resin prints. Resin dust can also be pretty bad for your lungs, so I'm always running a dust collector and wearing a respirator when I do this. Here I'm sanding down the dried wood filler on the base, going from 220 grit and working my way to 400 grit before primer. You'll also see me using this 2-inch chisel quite a bit on this project, but more on that in a minute. Alright, so this chisel has quickly become one of my favorite tools for processing prints before primer and paint. If you use a gentle hand and apply even pressure, it makes cleaning up supports and excess wood filler really easy. After being cured, resin can tend to be kind of brittle, and that actually works in your favor in this step. You'll see me going around on a lot of these parts using the sharp end to scrape everything level. Sometimes I can get away with just using this scraping method, but typically I'm going back with a fine-tooth file or some sandpaper just to clean everything up before priming or paint. And once I'm finished with scraping and sanding, I'll go back on all my parts with a damp microfiber cloth, just to make sure there's no dust before priming. I was kind of rushing this build, and so I missed a few spots where there was some obvious layer lines and some remnants of supports, but I was able to get rid of most of the layer lines with some filler primer, and then just before paint, scraped off a few of those supports. The main body of the blaster had the biggest issues with layer lines. I'm not sure if it was because the model was a little sloppy or if my printing was bad, but like I said, I was able to hide most of those layer lines with a little bit of this 2-in-1 sandable filler primer. I also had a lot of layer lines on these grips, so I ended up using a lot of coats of that filler primer. And after some sanding, went back with the chisel to clean up the details. And once I was happy with how the grips looked, I hit them with a coat of brown Krylon that I had laying around. I then did a bunch more sanding on all the parts that needed it and began shooting everything with a Rust-Oleum satin black. There are a few parts that needed gluing before paint, and so I did that too. Almost all of these parts are going to be dry brushed with some form of metallic paint, and so everything but the grips was painted with this satin black. Before I started on trying to paint the wood grain, I weathered the grips, since I realized I should have done that first. Before starting this project, I was looking around on YouTube to see if any other creators had tried to get a wood grain from resin prints, and I found this creator by the name of Off Earth. I'll link his video in the description. He used a bunch of different colored brown inks to get the look, and it was a pretty convincing effect. The closest thing I had was alcohol inks for dyeing resin. I knew that most likely mixing alcohol with rattle can paint was probably a bad idea, but I figured I'd give it a shot anyway. But sadly, as I began doing coat after coat, the alcohol in my inks was beginning to eat into the Krylon. And so eventually I just called it quits, knowing that I would need to repaint. Once the alcohol in the inks had dried and the paint was no longer gummy, I went back over it with that same brown rattle can. So for this iteration of the idea, I'm using a couple different colors of Vallejo paints over this brown rattle can. I'm using a black, a dark brown, a mid-tone brown, and then a light brown that's a bit orange in color. And so using this cheap 2-inch chip brush, I'm essentially dry brushing these colors on. Not really being too concerned about which color comes first, and sometimes I'm mixing the colors together, but the main thing that I'm thinking about is making sure that I'm just getting these nice streaky layers and slowly building that up. But on my final layer, I'm making sure to just use that light orangish brown to hit all the edges and to give just a few final light streaks through the entire grip. In the end, I don't really think that this reads as wood grain, but it still has this nice aged look that fits really well with the overall blaster. Once the paint was dry and I had glued those fake brass rivets in, I hit both the grips with a satin clear coat just to keep all that Vallejo paint safe. Okay, so you saw those little brass details in the previous shot, so we're going back in time to talk about dry brushing. Other than the wood grips, every piece on this blaster is some type of metal. There was a really great post on the rpf.com that went through a bunch of reference photos for the original blaster. I'll link that in the description. Most versions of this blaster that I see built online tend to be painted black and then just dry brushed with the same metal color throughout, aside from a few little brass pieces and then the tip of the gun, which is typically silver. But if you look at a lot of the reference photos of the original prop, you'll see that the blaster is made out of a lot of different shades of black coated metal. This is probably due to the fact that it was just thrown together by the prop department, pulling pieces from wherever they could find them. So I wanted to replicate that look and used a bunch of different shades of Vallejo's metal color line. I mostly used Vallejo's exhaust manifold, gunmetal gray, duraluminum, and dull aluminum, as well as rub and buff antique gold for the brass pieces. A few of these parts I felt like would be better off dry brushed together, and so I assembled those before fully beginning the dry brush. In a couple of the reference photos, I noticed that this little circle had a few pits that looked like it had been hammered into the metal. And so to accomplish that look, I used my Dremel tool, just kind of randomly placing little divots along the surface of the print. It's pretty cool that this model comes with a working trigger mechanism, and all you need to get it to work is a little rubber band. This little cover plate didn't come with a screw to be printed, and so I just chopped off the threads of one and glued it in place. Fun fact, this screw might be older than the original prop itself, since it comes from some of the old cabinets in my 1960s house. Another little detail that I wanted to point out is that although these scope brackets are typically painted black in replicas of this blaster, in the original photos you can kind of see that there's a faint brass color underneath the black coating. And so to replicate this look, I went over it with a pretty heavy brass dry brush, knowing that later I would go over this with a flat black acrylic paint. This model also didn't come with any lenses, and I ran out of time to print any, so I just left the scope empty on the inside. In the reference photos, you can also see that this little knob has a couple of straight slot screws in it, and so I did the same thing that I did with the screw in the body of the blaster and just chopped off the head of a couple of old straight slots. Alright, now for a little drama. As you can clearly see, once these two halves were fully assembled, they did not want to slide together. I was following the instructions that came along with these files, and this is the way that the instructions said to do it. And without double checking the fit of these two halves, I glued everything together beforehand. So after a bit of anger and panic, I came up with a solution. I used my utility knife to carefully shave down one side of the track on the main body. And then because the body was a bit flexible, I was able to squeeze the tracks together and just pop it into the sliding mechanism of the top half. I didn't get any good footage of this process since it was a bit traumatic and ultimately resulted in me breaking a few of the more brittle pieces on the blaster, which I then had to go back and glue. Fortunately though, it was all easily fixable, and I moved on to adding the scope. I had to do a little trimming on the support rods of this rail piece, but aside from that, assembly was a breeze. And then I quickly hit this little circle with a dab of aluminum paint, knowing that I would come back to darken the divots. For the scope bracket, I watered down some black Vallejo paint and kind of did a thick wash over the brass, not being concerned about coverage, just wanting to darken the brass dry brushing that I had done previously. I felt like this effect was pretty convincing since it just looks like the coating of the metal is slowly wearing away with age. After that, I glued in the grips and moved on to weathering the blaster as a whole. Before starting my chalk weathering, I hit the whole thing with a grimy wash. I just used some cheap black and brown paint for this, and I tend to like to mix a lot of black into my brown so that I get this color that looks like old motor oil. That really adds a lot of grime to the prop. I mixed this wash pretty thin since I didn't want the effect to be super heavy. But ultimately the amount of weathering you do is totally up to you. Okay, so using pastel chalks is quickly becoming my favorite technique for weathering my props. It's super quick and easy, but adds a ton of character and texture. I use matte Mod Podge watered down with some IPA, and then dab it into all the nooks and crannies that I think should get really gunked up. From there, I'm mostly using black and brown chalk to add that layer of gunk. Here and there, I might use some really gross green colors, or maybe some flecks of a more orange tone to simulate rust. But on this particular build, I was just going for dirty grunge, not so much rust or corrosion. I also hit the nose of the blaster with black chalk to simulate burn marks. I tend to let the chalk sit for a bit and then blow the excess off. This method is super easy to control and can be easily wiped away if you feel like you've done too much in a spot. But once I'm happy with the look of my part, I go over everything with a matte enamel to seal everything in place. And with that, this baby was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. Although this one was a lot more rushed than my previous projects, I still feel like it came out looking pretty great, and I definitely learned a lot along the way. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. I'm excited to see where this channel goes, and I appreciate everybody who's already subscribed. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.